Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Master of None here. Today I want to talk to you about my first experiences in PvP with the Mechanist. A couple days ago I did the same thing but for PvE instead if you are interested in that. And if you are enjoying any of my videos, make sure to subscribe for more GW2 content. I want to preface this video with the fact that I have very little experience with Engineer, and it's probably the reason why I enjoyed playing the Mechanist so much. Even with my limited experience, I still think we can have a discussion about how the Mechanist functions in PvP and about pet classes and issues in general. It's much simpler to play than the other Engineer specs, and there is a lot less going on, so it didn't take very long to pick up the basics. The mech also hits really hard if you're running a Berserker amulet like I was, because it will inherit some of your offensive stats if you choose the right trait. From the couple days that I've played, I think it will be a bit of a pop stomper class, similar to Dragon Hunter. The mech is easily line of sighted and kited, so I suspect it is not going to be very effective in higher end play, but if you just let it do its thing, it will absolutely mess you up. Traditionally, AI builds in Guild Wars 2 PvP get nerfed into the ground, and rightfully so. However, I would argue that the Mechanist should be allowed to be strong and do a lot of damage with its pet, and I just mentioned why. There is a lot of counterplay to the mech. You can easily trick it, hide behind a pillar, use elevation, etc. On top of that, the mech is huge and its animations are really obvious. It literally shoots a giant green ball of doom. This is very different to the turret engie back in the day, or the minion monster build that plagues the lower brackets nowadays, since there you would just get attacked from all sides with little packets of damage, often not sure what to dodge or what to do about it. So for me it comes down to counterplay. I have to say, I quite like the notion where the mech is the big threat and I'm just its little minion that tells it what to do. Against the Mechanist in a 1v1 you probably have to pay more attention to the mech attacks instead of the Engineer. This is exactly what the class fantasy of having a giant robot do the work for you is about, so I thoroughly enjoyed that aspect. On the topic of builds, I tried out different variations over the course of the beta. Probably a lot of it is suboptimal, but I just went with the first build that I found on Meta Battle for Holosmith and changed the Holo trade line to the Mechanist. This worked pretty well as long as there were no Condi classes on the other team, since I had basically no Condi clans. As the days progressed, I even went into inventions at some point for higher protection uptime and Condi removal on shield, but ultimately ended up with a cleansing sigil and elixir gun instead of grenades. Conditions were still very much a weakness of this build though, and they would completely annihilate my mech as well. Before we talk more about the mech, I quickly want to mention the Mace shield weapon combo. Just like in PvE, it felt quite good. The range stun on Mace 3 is great and the weapon combo itself has so much utility. You get a leap, a stun, projectile reflect, push, block and a daze, all in one bar. You can then combine it with a kit to add whatever you are missing, be it grenades for more damage and range DPS or elixir gun for even more utility and also a bit of range pressure. So I don't have too much to say here since it felt pretty good already. The mech, however, has a couple of issues besides being a janky AI robot. I mentioned this both in the Untamed video and the first Mechanist video, but not having a pet attack button feels really bad. The return to me button is also no longer bindable since the Untamed and the Mechanist have more skills in the pet bar, which is incredibly annoying. These two basic commands are a must for an enjoyable experience and to have somewhat decent control over your pet. Otherwise you get things like this. Which brings me to another point. The mech has a way too long of a leash. At some point it was literally fighting on mid while I was trying to cap far, and it just wouldn't want to come to me. While a part of me would find it kind of hilarious if you could send your giant robot to mid at the start of the game and you yourself cap home in the meantime, making the mid fight basically a 4v5, I don't think it's healthy for the game. It would make much more sense if it had a similar range and behavior like ranger pets. I've seen a lot of people talking about how bad it feels losing your mech since the cooldown is so long. To be honest, I never had this issue in PvE. It's really damn tanky, and I wish the Elite Signet with the J-Buster cannon would do a lot more damage so it feels worth using. In PvP, however, I found myself constantly holding on to the Signet, just so I can resummon my mech when it dies. You feel like a sitting duck once your mech is dead. I even found myself waiting 20 seconds off node when I respawned, just so I could resummon my mech, because it felt like I couldn't do anything without it anyway. I'm not sure how I feel about that. On one hand, if that's what it takes to balance the mech and make it so it can actually do some damage, fine. But on the other hand, the cooldown is probably a bit too long and should be adjusted. Or at the very least, the mech should respawn with you after you die and not still be on cooldown. Perfect segue to another quirky thing. Whenever you die, the mech doesn't despawn instantly and instead stands there for another 5 or so seconds just blasting people. I assume it's a bug, but this definitely needs to get fixed. I've had a couple situations where my mech would just down a person after I got defeated, which I imagine is pretty infuriating, especially if it was a 1v1 on a side node, for example. Another thing I didn't like is that whenever you press a mech attack, it doesn't seem to check if it has line of sight and instead it just starts firing. You can call it a learn to play issue where you just have to wait with pressing ability until you see that your mech can hit the target, but I found it a bit awkward. Even more so in PvE, where just a little bit of elevation in the open world will cause a skill to miss completely. In the PvE video, I mentioned how I wish the mech would have more customization options in terms of visuals, and a lot of you guys had some great ideas regarding this. Multiple people wrote how cool it would be if the color and the look of the mech would change depending on what traits you picked. So for example, the middle row of traits, which also determines which stats your mech inherits, would change the color of the mech. The Grandmaster trait could then change what kind of arms or shoulders and visible weapons it has. Things like that. I think this would be awesome and would also benefit PvP, since then you could tell at a glance what type of attacks you can expect from a mech and give it more counterplay. However, I kind of doubt that ANET would go that route, since at the end it's supposed to be a Jade mech, but time will tell. All these issues aside, I still had a great time with the Mechanist and enjoyed every second of it. It reminded me a lot of the Borderlands 2 character Gage. For me personally, this beta was a lot better than the last. All of the specs still need quite a bit of work, but they didn't feel totally off like the Catalyst did. I'm hoping that when we get beta 4 at the end of November, we will already see some changes to the earlier specs, so fingers crossed. That is all for today, so thank you for watching and I hope to see you in the next one.